Miss Texas, second runner-up. That sash meant everything to me until I met Alexander Crown. He whispered in my ear that night, "You're not just another pretty face in a tiara, Valentina. You're the one I've been searching for across continents." I believed every word. What I didn't know was that he'd said the exact same thing to Miss Latvia in Riga, Miss Philippines in Manila, and Miss Morocco in Casablanca. I was never his dream girl. I was just another crown in his twisted collection. Stay with me, and I'll tell you how a charming businessman from New York systematically hunted beauty queens across 7 countries, how he used our dreams and insecurities against us, and how he finally discovered that behind his perfect smile was a predator who saw us not as women, but as trophies to be conquered and financially drained. Hello, everyone. My name is Valentina Chen. I'm 29 years old, from Dallas, Texas, and I'm a former beauty pageant contestant. This story still haunts me years later, but I need to share it because when I was desperately searching manipulative boyfriend targets beauty queens at 4 a.m., I found nothing. If you're a woman in pageantry, modeling, or any competitive field where your appearance matters and you're dating someone who seems too good to be true, maybe my story will save you from becoming another trophy in someone's sick collection. The ballroom at the Four Seasons downtown Dallas was glittering that October evening. The annual Hearts for Hope charity gala brought together Texas elites, and as a recent Miss Texas runner-up, I was invited to represent the pageant community. I wore a midnight blue Giovanni gown that had cost me 3 months of my marketing coordinator salary, but it was worth it. These events were networking gold for someone like me trying to build a career in event planning while still riding the wave of pageant recognition. I was standing near the auction display, pretending to be interested in the weekend getaway to Napa Valley that I definitely couldn't afford, when I heard this smooth, confident voice behind me. The Tuscany package is much better, more authentic vineyards, fewer tourist traps. I turned around and there he was, tall, probably 6'2", with perfectly styled dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through you. He was wearing what I would later learn was a custom Armani tuxedo, and his confidence filled the space around him like expensive cologne. "Oh, have you been?" I asked, immediately feeling silly for such a basic question. "Many times. I have business connections in Europe. Import, export, luxury goods mostly." He extended his hand. "Alexander Crown? And you must be Valentina Chen, Miss Texas runner-up. I saw your talent performance online. That contemporary dance piece about women's empowerment was extraordinary." Here's where I should have been suspicious. Most people at these events knew I'd placed in Miss Texas, but they never knew specific details about my talent. They certainly didn't watch pageant videos online. But instead of red flags, I saw green lights. This gorgeous, successful man had actually paid attention to me, not just my sash. "You watched my talent?" I laughed, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. Most people just know about the Q&A portion where I accidentally said world hunger twice in one answer. Most people don't appreciate artistry when they see it. His eyes never left mine. I've been to Miss Universe, Miss World, several international pageants for business. What you did up there wasn't just performance, it was storytelling. There's a difference. The conversation flowed like he choreographed it. He asked about my platform, Ending Domestic Violence, and shared that his company donated to women's shelters internationally. He knew about pageant scoring systems, about the politics behind the scenes, about the financial pressures contestants face. But he didn't share this knowledge in a creepy, obsessive way. Instead, he presented it as business acumen, cultural awareness from his travels. "The pageant industry has so much untapped potential," he said, as we moved to a quieter corner near the silent auction. "These women are educated, multilingual, passionate about causes, In Europe, former Miss contestants become serious businesswomen, politicians, media personalities. Here in America, they're treated like temporary entertainment. This was exactly what I wanted to hear. I'd been struggling with post-pageant depression, that lost feeling when the spotlight moves on and you're just another pretty girl with a crown gathering dust on her dresser. I've actually been thinking about that, I admitted. I have my degree in communications, I speak 3 languages, I've raised thousands for charity, but most employers just see me as the pageant girl. What languages? His interest seemed genuine, not like he was testing me. Spanish, I'm half Mexican on my mother's side, Mandarin from my father's family, and I learned French in college. Something flickered in his eyes. Not surprise, but satisfaction, like I just confirmed something he already suspected. Extraordinary. Do you know how rare that combination is in international business? I'm working on expanding my company's presence in Latin America and Asia. The cultural bridge you could provide? He paused as if catching himself getting too excited. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You probably have your own plans. The evening continued like that. He'd share fascinating stories about international pageants he'd attended for business, how Miss Philippines contestants were treated like celebrities, how European pageants focused more on intelligence than American ones, how Latin American winners often leveraged their titles into major media careers. Each story felt like he was showing me a glimpse of the life I could have had, should have had. When dinner was announced, I was disappointed to realize we'd be sitting at different tables, but Alexander smoothly handled that too. I'm sorry, this is presumptuous, but would you consider joining me? I purchased a table, but I'm here alone tonight, and frankly, the conversation would be much better with someone who actually thinks beyond their stock portfolio. I should have wondered why a successful businessman was at a charity gala alone. Instead, I was flattered that he preferred my company to his original plans. During dinner, his attention was completely focused on me. While other conversations swirled around philanthropy and business deals, Alexander asked about my goals, my frustrations, my dreams beyond pageantry. He didn't interrupt or offer immediate solutions like most men did. Instead, he listened with the kind of focus that made me feel like I was the most fascinating person in the room.
You know what I find interesting about you, Valentina? He said during dessert, leaning closer so only I could hear. Most beautiful women rely on their looks to open doors. You use yours as a starting point, then prove there's substance behind it. That's rare. The compliment was perfectly crafted, acknowledging my beauty while emphasizing my intelligence, making me feel seen for who I really was, not just what I looked like. As the evening wound down, Alexander walked me to the valet stand. Instead of immediately asking for my number like most men would, he did something different. I've really enjoyed talking with you tonight, Valentina. You've given me a lot to think about regarding the untapped potential in pageant communities. He pulled out his business card, thick, cream-colored paper with simple, elegant lettering. I'd love to continue this conversation sometime, but I don't want you to feel pressured. If you're interested in learning more about international opportunities for women with your background, give me a call. No expectations, just good conversation. The card read, Alexander Crown, CEO, Crown International Imports Ltd., with a Manhattan address and multiple phone numbers. I travel frequently, but I'll be in Dallas for the rest of the month working on a new venture. Maybe you could show me the best coffee shops. I'm tired of hotel lobbies. It was perfect. Low pressure, respectful, but clearly interested. As I drove home that night, I kept glancing at his business card on my passenger seat, already planning when I'd call. What I didn't know was that Alexander had done his homework long before that evening. He'd studied my pageant videos, my social media, my LinkedIn profile. He knew my background, my insecurities about post-pageant life, my financial struggles. That chance meeting at the charity gala wasn't chance at all. He'd bought his ticket specifically because he knew I'd be there. And I wasn't his first target. 3 weeks earlier, he'd used almost identical lines on a former Miss Latvia who was working as a translator in New York. 2 months before that, it was Miss Philippines, struggling to launch her own beauty brand in Los Angeles. But I didn't know any of this as I fell asleep that night, already wondering if Alexander Crown might be the answer to my prayers for a meaningful life after pageants. I called him 2 days later, trying to sound casual. We met for coffee at a trendy spot in Deep Ellum, and that's when the real seduction began. Our coffee date stretched into a 4-hour conversation that felt like it lasted minutes. Alexander had this gift for making you feel like you were the most interesting person he'd ever met. While other men usually dominated conversations with their own achievements, Alexander asked questions that made me examine my own thoughts in ways I'd never considered. "You know what's fascinating about pageant women," he said as we walked through the arts district after coffee? "You're all natural entrepreneurs, but you don't realize it. Think about it. You've essentially built a personal brand, managed sponsorships, created marketing campaigns for your platforms, handled media relations, organized fundraising events. Most MBA programs don't teach practical experience like that." He was right, and hearing him articulate it made me see myself differently. I wasn't just a former pageant contestant struggling to find her place. I was a young professional with unique skills that I'd never properly valued. "Have you ever considered consulting?" he continued. "There are beauty companies, fashion brands, even tech startups that pay 6 figures for the kind of cultural insight and marketing understanding you have naturally." By the end of our first real date, Alexander had painted a picture of my potential I'd never imagined. He didn't just see who I was, he saw who I could become. The next week, he was traveling for business, but he didn't disappear like most men would. Instead, he sent me photos from his trip to Miami, backstage at a Miss Universe rehearsal where he was meeting with potential business partners in the beauty industry. "Reminded me of our conversation about untapped potential," his text read. "These women are running multi-million-dollar businesses. You could do this better than half of them." It wasn't empty flattery. Alexander seemed genuinely connected to the pageant world in ways that legitimized his interest in me. When he returned to Dallas, he brought me a gift that proved how carefully he'd been listening. "I saw this and thought of you," he said, handing me an elegant box from a boutique I'd never heard of. Inside was a silk scarf with a pattern that incorporated elements from all 3 cultures I told him about. Subtle nods to Mexican, Chinese, and American design motifs woven together beautifully. It's from a designer in Barcelona who creates pieces celebrating multicultural identity, like you. He helped me drape it around my shoulders. The woman who made this said beauty comes from the intersection of different worlds, not from trying to fit into just one. The gift was perfect, thoughtful, expensive without being overwhelming, and deeply personal. It showed that not only had he remembered our conversation about my mixed heritage, but had taken the time to find something that honored it. Over the next month, Alexander courted me with a sophistication I'd never experienced. Instead of typical dinner dates, he took me to art gallery openings where he seemed to know the artists personally. He introduced me as his brilliant friend Valentina to successful people who treated me like an equal. Valentina speaks 5 languages and has one of the most innovative approaches to cause marketing I've encountered. He'd say, somehow inflating my actual 3 languages and making my pageant platform work sound more impressive than it actually was. But he said it with such conviction that I started believing it myself. The gifts continued, but they were always tied to my interests and goals, rather than generic romantic gestures. A first edition book about international women's rights activism, inscribed with a note about how my domestic violence platform could have global impact. Professional photography sessions
for my consulting portfolio with photographers who normally shot Fortune 500 executives. A weekend trip to Houston to attend a conference about women in international business, where he paid for everything but presented it as a networking opportunity rather than a romantic getaway. "I learn as much from you as you do from these events," he insisted when I tried to protest the expensive conference fees. "Your perspective on cultural bridge building is exactly what my company needs to understand. Consider it a business consultation where we both benefit." He was positioning himself as a mentor and collaborator rather than just a boyfriend, which felt mature and respectful. Other men had tried to impress me with expensive dinners and jewelry. Alexander invested in my growth and potential. The physical progression was equally masterful. He didn't rush or pressure. Instead, he created moments of intimacy that felt natural and meaningful. A hand on my back as he guided me through a crowded gallery opening, standing close enough behind me to point out details in a painting that I could feel his warmth. Casual touches that made me want more without making me feel pursued. When he finally kissed me, it was after we'd been talking for hours on his hotel room balcony about our childhood dreams. The kiss felt like the natural culmination of weeks of intellectual and emotional connection, not just physical attraction. "I didn't expect this," he whispered afterward, his forehead resting against mine. "I came to Dallas for business, but you've made me reconsider everything about what I want my life to look like." The vulnerable admission made me feel powerful and special. This successful, worldly man was changing his plans because of me. By our 2-month mark, Alexander started sharing more personal details that made me feel trusted with his private world. His parents had died in a car accident when he was in college, which explained why he seemed so self-reliant. He'd built his import business from nothing, working 18-hour days for years to achieve his current success. He was tired of superficial relationships with women who only saw his money and status. "I've dated models, actresses, even a few pageant winners from other countries," he admitted one evening as we walked through Clyde Warren Park. "But they all wanted the lifestyle, not the person. You're the first woman who's more interested in building something meaningful than in what I can buy her." It was the perfect confession, acknowledging his romantic history while making me feel completely different from all the women who came before. I wasn't just another beautiful woman in his life. I was the one who saw his true value.
The future planning started subtly. Alexander would mention business trips and casually suggest I might enjoy certain cities. Santiago has an incredible art scene. The women's rights movement there is really sophisticated, right up your alley. Or, "I need to spend a month in Manila next spring setting up a new supply chain. The Miss Philippines organization there is very politically active. You'd find their approach fascinating." He never directly invited me on these trips, but he planted seeds that made me imagine traveling the world with him, combining his business expertise with my cultural insights and pageant connections. "You know what I think you should consider?" he said one evening over dinner at a restaurant where the sommelier knew him by name. "International consulting for beauty brands trying to expand globally. You understand the cultural nuances, you have the pageant connections, and you think strategically about marketing. There are companies that pay 7 figures for that kind of specialized knowledge." 7 figures. The number hung in the air like a promise. I was making $45,000 a year at my marketing job, still paying off pageant expenses and college loans. The idea that my unique background could be worth millions was intoxicating. "I could introduce you to some contacts," Alexander continued. "I know the CEO of a major cosmetics company that's trying to break into Latin American markets. They need someone who understands both the cultural dynamics and the influence networks. You'd be perfect." He wasn't just telling me I was beautiful or special, he was showing me a concrete path to the kind of success and recognition I dreamed about. While other men promised vague futures, Alexander offered specific opportunities that aligned with my actual ambitions. The love bombing was so sophisticated that it never felt like manipulation. Instead,
It felt like finally being understood by someone who saw my full potential. Alexander wasn't trying to change me or mold me into what he wanted. He was amplifying the best parts of who I already was. What I didn't realize was that he'd used variations of these same techniques with other women. The gifts were always culturally specific to each target. Flamenco-inspired jewelry for the Latina contestants, tech accessories for the Asian contestants, art pieces for the European ones. The business opportunities he dangled were tailored to each woman's background and insecurities. The vulnerable personal details about his orphaned childhood and previous relationships were scripted confessions designed to create false intimacy. But in those first few months, I felt like I'd finally found someone who not only loved me for who I was, but could help me become who I was meant to be. Alexander Crown felt like destiny, not just romance. The financial requests hadn't started yet. The mask hadn't slipped. I was still his perfect, special, brilliant Valentina, the woman who was going to change his life and achieve incredible success with his guidance and connections. I was completely, blissfully unaware that I was just the latest addition to his collection of crowns. 3 months into our relationship, Alexander's business faced its first temporary setback. He handled it with such grace and transparency that it actually made me trust him more, not less. "I need to be honest with you about something, Valentina," he said during what I thought would be a routine dinner date. We were at our usual spot, an upscale restaurant in Bishop Arts, where the staff knew us as regulars. There's been a complication with one of my major shipments. Customs issues in Singapore. Nothing serious, just expensive to resolve quickly.
He explained the situation with the kind of detail that made it seem legitimate. Import duties had changed unexpectedly, requiring additional documentation and fees. His usual contact at the shipping company was on medical leave, leaving the shipment in bureaucratic limbo. The delay was costing him storage fees and threatening contracts with retailers who were expecting their inventory. The frustrating part is that I have the money. My accounts are just tied up in other investments that I can't liquidate quickly without taking huge losses. He ran his hand through his hair in a gesture I'd learned meant he was stressed. I've been building this business for 8 years, and I've never missed a delivery deadline. My reputation is everything in this industry. What made this conversation feel authentic was that Alexander wasn't asking me for anything. He was just sharing his stress with his girlfriend, the way couples do. He even insisted on paying for dinner as usual, saying that his personal expenses weren't affected, just the business cash flow. "I'll figure it out," he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I always do. I just hate that I can't take you on that weekend trip to Santa Fe we talked about. The timing is terrible." The Santa Fe trip had been his idea, a long weekend visiting art galleries and exploring Native American culture, something I'd mentioned wanting to do since childhood. The fact that he was canceling a romantic getaway because of business ethics made him seem even more admirable. 2 weeks later, the situation had escalated. Alexander was working 18-hour days trying to resolve the customs issue, and I could see the stress wearing on him. He'd lost weight, had dark circles under his eyes, and was constantly fielding urgent phone calls in Mandarin and Spanish, languages I could understand enough to know he was negotiating with frustrated business partners. "I might have to let this shipment go," he admitted one evening when he came to my apartment looking exhausted. "Take the loss and rebuild those relationships over time. It's not ideal, but sometimes you have to make difficult choices to preserve your integrity." This is when Alexander's manipulation became brilliant. Instead of presenting himself as a victim or making dramatic appeals for help,
Alexander was positioning himself as a principled businessman, willing to take significant financial losses rather than compromise his values or ask anyone else to bail him out. "What about a business loan?" I suggested, curled up next to him on my couch while he absently played with my hair. "I've tried. Banks move slowly, and the loan officers don't understand international trade complications. They see customs delays and assume I'm some kind of smuggler." He laughed bitterly. 8 years of perfect credit history, and they want 6 months of documentation for a 30-day loan. Over the next few weeks, I watched Alexander handle his crisis with what I thought was impressive dignity. He never complained excessively, never dramatized his situation, and never made it my problem. But I could see the toll it was taking on him and on our relationship. Our dates became less frequent and less expensive. Instead of nice restaurants, we'd cook at my apartment or his hotel suite. Instead of cultural events, we'd watch movies or just talk. Alexander insisted this was actually better, more intimate, more authentic. But I could tell he was embarrassed about the change in our lifestyle. "I'm sorry," he said one evening after I'd cooked dinner for us. "This isn't what you signed up for when we started dating. You deserve better than a boyfriend who's stressed about business problems." The apology was perfectly crafted. It acknowledged the impact on our relationship while reinforcing that he was a good man, facing temporary difficulties, not a failure or a user. "Don't be ridiculous," I told him. "This is what relationships are, supporting each other through difficult times. Besides, some of my favorite moments with you have been like this, just us talking." He pulled me closer and kissed my top of my head. "You're incredible, you know that? Most women would have walked away by now." The comment was designed to make me feel special, while planting the seed that staying with him during this difficult time proved I was different from other women, more loyal, more understanding, more worthy of his eventual success. A month later, the crisis reached its peak. Alexander's Singapore contact had finally returned from medical leave, but resolving the customs issue required an immediate payment that was just beyond what Alexander could manage with his current cash flow. "It's the most frustrating thing I've ever experienced," he told me, pacing around his hotel suite like a caged animal. "I need $8,000 to free up a shipment worth $150,000. The math is simple. The profit margin is guaranteed, but I'm $8,000 short of making it work." He showed me the documentation, customs forms, shipping manifests, communication with retailers who were waiting on their orders. Everything looked legitimate and professional. "What happens if you can't come up with it?" I asked. "I lose the entire shipment. The customs authority auctions it off, my retail partners cancel their contracts, and I'm out about $200,000 total. It would take me 2 years to rebuild from that kind of loss." He sat down heavily on the couch next to me. "I've been calling everyone I know, business contacts, former colleagues, even distant relatives. No one has that kind of liquid cash available on short notice." This was the moment Alexander had been building toward for months. He'd established himself as successful and principled, demonstrated a genuine crisis with legitimate documentation, shown that he was exhausting all other options before considering anything desperate. The groundwork was perfect. "What about borrowing it?" I suggested carefully. Alexander looked at me sharply. "Valentina, no, absolutely not. I would never ask you for money. That's not what this relationship is about." His immediate rejection was crucial. It made me feel like I was offering help rather than being manipulated into giving it. It also reinforced his character. He was too proud and too principled to ask his girlfriend for financial help. But what if I wanted to help? What if I thought of it as an investment in our future? "You don't have that kind of money," he said gently. "And even if you did, I couldn't take it.
Mixing business and personal relationships is how people get hurt. But I could see him wavering, and the possibility of losing him to this crisis made me more determined to help. Alexander, I have savings. I have credit cards. I believe in you and your business. I took his hands in mine. Let me help you get through this. We're a team, right? The conversation continued for another hour, with Alexander putting up just enough resistance to make me feel like I was convincing him rather than being convinced. Finally, he agreed to let me invest $10,000 in his business as a short-term loan that would be repaid with interest once the customs issue was resolved. I'll pay you back within 60 days with 20% interest, he promised. And I'll give you documentation for everything: contracts, receipts, payment schedules. This is a legitimate business transaction, not a favor between boyfriend and girlfriend. The formal approach made it feel safer and more professional. Alexander drew up an official-looking loan agreement on his company letterhead, complete with repayment terms and my percentage of the profits from the resolved shipment. I transferred $10,000 from my savings account to his business account, money I'd been saving since my pageant days for a down payment on a condo. It felt scary and exciting at the same time, like I was finally investing in something bigger than just my own small dreams. The customs issue was resolved within a week. Alexander showed me confirmation that his shipment had been released and was on its way to his retail partners. He was back to his confident, successful self, taking me to celebratory dinners and talking about the business expansion this resolved crisis would enable. "You saved me, Valentina," he said over champagne at the restaurant where we'd had our first real date. "I won't forget what you did, and I won't let you down." The repayment was supposed to come in 60 days, but when that deadline approached, Alexander had another complication. The retailers were slower to pay than expected, and he needed to use the incoming revenue to fund the next shipment in order to maintain his momentum. "I can pay you back the principal now, or I can keep your money working for another month and pay you the full amount plus interest. It's your choice, but honestly, the return on keeping it invested is significant." I chose to let the money keep working. The interest he was offering was better than any savings account, and I trusted his business judgment. This decision established a pattern: my money becoming more and more integrated into his business operations, always with the promise of bigger returns if I just waited a little longer. Over the next 6 months, Alexander's business faced a series of opportunities that required quick capital infusions. A chance to buy inventory at a significant discount, but only if he could pay cash immediately. A new supplier offering exclusive territory rights, but requiring an upfront investment. A retail partner wanting to double their order, but needing faster shipping that cost more money. Each situation was presented with documentation, explanations, and profit projections. Alexander never asked for money directly. Instead, he'd share his business challenges and opportunities, and I'd suggest ways I could help. The request escalated gradually, $5,000 here, $8,000 there, until I'd invested nearly $30,000 in his various business ventures. I liquidated my savings, maxed out credit cards, and even borrowed money from my parents under the pretense of wanting to invest in real estate. Alexander provided official receipts for everything, maintained detailed records of what I was owed, and regularly updated me on how my investments were performing. "You're not just my girlfriend," he told me during one of our financial discussions. "You're my business partner. When this company goes public, you're going to be a very wealthy woman." The promise of eventual wealth, combined with the professional way he handled our financial arrangements, made me feel like a savvy investor rather than a victim. I was helping to build something significant with someone I loved, using money that would eventually make us both rich. What I didn't know was that there was no import business.
The customs documents were forged, the shipping manifests were fake, and the business partners I sometimes heard him talking to on the phone were other women he was simultaneously scamming in different cities. Alexander had perfected a system of creating artificial business crises that required immediate capital, backed up with professional-looking documentation and emotional manipulation disguised as relationship building. The money I was investing was funding his lifestyle and his ability to maintain multiple fake relationships across different countries. But from my perspective, I was living a fairy tale. I had a successful, worldly boyfriend who valued my opinions and included me in his business decisions. I was building wealth and preparing for a future that would combine love, travel, and financial security. The red flags were all there, but Alexander had given me logical explanations for each one. His business was international and complex. Of course, there would be complications I didn't understand. High-return investments always carried some risk. That's why the potential profits were so significant. Successful entrepreneurs had to make quick decisions with incomplete information. That's what separated them from employees who waited for guarantees. I felt sophisticated and special, not stupid and victimized. I was Alexander Crown's chosen partner in life and business, not just another mark in his long-term con game. The trap was perfectly set, and I had walked into it with my eyes wide open, convinced I was making the smartest decision of my life. The first crack appeared during a dinner we shared 6 months into our relationship. Alexander had just returned from what he called a quick business trip to Los Angeles, and he seemed different, distracted, almost nervous. We were at our usual spot in Bishop's Arts, but instead of his typical focused attention on me, he kept checking his phone and scanning the restaurant like he was expecting someone. "Is everything okay?" I asked after the third time his phone buzzed and he quickly flipped it face down without looking at the message. "Just business stuff. The LA expansion is more complicated than I anticipated." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. There are cultural dynamics in the West Coast market that I didn't fully appreciate. Something about the way he said cultural dynamics felt off. Alexander usually loved explaining his business challenges to me. He said my perspective helped him think through problems differently. But this time, he was being vague and evasive. "What kind of cultural dynamics?" I pressed, genuinely curious about how his business worked. "Just different expectations around relationship building. West Coast business culture is more casual, but also more guarded. It takes time to establish trust." He reached across the table and took my hand. "Enough about work. How was your week?" The deflection was smooth, but it was still a deflection. Alexander had never been secretive about his business before. If anything, he'd been almost too transparent, showing me documents and contracts and profit projections. This sudden vagueness felt like a change in our dynamic. Later that evening, while Alexander was in the bathroom, his phone buzzed again. It was sitting on the coffee table in my living room, and the notification preview showed part of a text message. "So excited for, can't wait to see." I wasn't trying to spy, but the partial message was visible on the lock screen. When Alexander returned, I mentioned it casually. "Your phone was buzzing. Looked like someone's excited about Friday?" For just a split second, I saw something flash across his face. Panic, maybe, or calculation. But he recovered quickly. "My assistant. She's excited about a potential new contract we're finalizing Friday. Big retail chain that's been slow to commit." He picked up his phone and glanced at it. "I should probably respond to this tonight. Business on the West Coast doesn't sleep." The explanation was reasonable, but something about his body language felt wrong. Alexander was usually relaxed and open with me, but now he seemed guarded, like he was carefully managing information. Over the next few weeks, I noticed more inconsistencies. Phone calls in languages I didn't recognize, not Spanish or Mandarin, which I knew he used for business, but something that sounded Eastern European. Quick trips that he'd mention casually, almost as afterthoughts. Oh, I need to fight a phoenix this weekend. Quick supplier meeting. Or, Miami business is heating up. I'll be back Tuesday. These weren't the carefully planned business trips he told me about before, with detailed explanations of what he hoped to accomplish and why the timing was important. These were sudden, urgent trips that he presented as no big deal, but which seemed to be happening with increasing frequency. "You're traveling a lot lately," I mentioned one evening when he told me he'd be gone the following weekend for another quick supplier meeting. "Growing business requires constant attention," he said, but his tone was slightly defensive. "I know it's not ideal for us, but this expansion phase is critical. Once I get the West Coast and Southeast operations stabilized, I'll be able to delegate more." Again, the explanation was logical, but it felt different from how he'd talked about business travel before. Previously, he'd seemed excited about his trips, eager to share what he learned and how it would benefit our future together. Now his travel felt secretive and separate from our relationship. The most troubling incident happened during one of his Miami trips. Alexander had been gone for 4 days, and we'd been texting regularly as usual, but when he called me Thursday night, something was wrong with his story. "How's the weather down there?" I asked, making casual conversation. "Typical Miami, hot and humid. Good thing most of my meetings are indoors." But I'd been following a major storm system on social media, and Miami had been experiencing unusually cool temperatures and heavy rain all week. Multiple friends had posted about the unexpected weather ruining their beach plans. "Really? My friend Jessica posted that it's been raining there all week. She said it's only in the 60s. Another pause, longer this time. "Oh yeah, it has been raining. I guess I've been inside so much I wasn't really paying attention to the temperature. You know how it is with back-to-back meetings." The correction felt forced and awkward. Alexander was usually so smooth, so confident in conversation. This stumbling over basic details about where he supposedly was felt completely out of character. That night, I found myself doing something I'd never done before. I started paying attention to his social media activity. Alexander wasn't very active on Instagram or Facebook, which he'd always said was because he preferred to keep his business life private. But when I looked more carefully, I noticed that his location tags didn't always match where he told me he was traveling. 2 weeks earlier, when he'd said he was in Phoenix for a supplier meeting, his Instagram had briefly shown a location tag for somewhere in New York before he deleted the post entirely. When I asked him about it later, he said he'd accidentally tagged the wrong location because he'd been thinking about a previous trip. I started screenshotting things, not because I was planning to confront him, but because I was beginning to doubt my own memory. Was I remembering his travel schedule correctly? Had he actually said he was going to Phoenix, or had I misunderstood? The inconsistencies were subtle enough that I wondered if I was being paranoid. The breaking point came during what should have been a romantic evening. Alexander had returned from another Los Angeles trip and suggested we celebrate a major contract he supposedly just signed. We were at a new restaurant in Deep Ellum, and he was more attentive than he'd been in weeks. Back to his old self, asking about my work, sharing funny stories from his travels. "I have something for you," he said during dessert, pulling out a small wrapped box. Inside was a beautiful pair of earrings with stones that caught the light like tiny stars. "They're gorgeous," I said, genuinely touched. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion. I saw them in Beverly Hills and thought of you. They reminded me of that dress you wore to the charity Met Gala where we met." He reached over to help me put them on. Beautiful women deserve beautiful things.
It was a perfect romantic gesture, the kind of thoughtful gift that had made me fall for him in the first place. But as he fastened the second earring, I caught a scent that made me freeze. Perfume. Not mine, something floral and heavy that I would never wear. It was faint, probably transferred to his hands or clothes, but it was definitely there. "These are really special," I managed to say, my mind racing. "Where in Beverly Hills did you find them?" "Little boutique on Rodeo Drive." The owner was this older woman who kept talking about how important it is to find jewelry that matches a woman's personality, not just her outfit. Alexander smiled as he admired how the earrings looked on me. She said these were perfect for someone with sophisticated taste, but a warm heart. The story was charming and detailed, the kind of personal touch that made his gifts feel meaningful. But the perfume scent lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that these earrings had been chosen by someone else, for someone else, maybe even worn by someone else. That night, as Alexander slept beside me, I lay awake thinking about all the small inconsistencies I'd been noticing. The mysterious phone calls, the vague travel explanations, the weather confusion, and now perfume that wasn't mine on a supposedly brand new gift. Individually, each incident had a reasonable explanation. Alexander was a busy businessman with complicated international operations. Of course, there would be phone calls I couldn't understand, travel schedules that changed quickly, and details he might get confused or forget to mention. The perfume could have come from anywhere: a crowded store, a business meeting, even just sitting next to someone on an airplane. But taken together, the inconsistencies were forming a pattern that made me uncomfortable. It felt like Alexander was managing multiple versions of his life, and I was only being shown one of them. The next morning, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I Googled his business. Crown International Imports brought up a professional-looking website with the same logo as his business cards. The site listed offices in New York, Los Angeles, and Miami, which matched the cities he's been visiting. There were photos of shipping containers and warehouses, testimonials from satisfied retailers, and detailed information about their import specialties. Everything looked legitimate and professional. But when I clicked on the Our Team section, there were only stock photos with generic names and titles. No picture of Alexander, no detailed bio of the CEO and founder. For someone who was supposedly building international business relationships, he had a remarkably little online presence. I tried searching for Alexander Crown CEO and found almost nothing. A few mentions in import trade publications, but no interviews, no conference presentations, no industry awards or recognition. For comparison, I looked up other business owners in similar industries, and they all had much more visible professional footprints. The lack of information was suspicious, but it could also mean Alexander was just private about his business operations. Import-export could be a competitive industry where maintaining a low profile was advantageous. Still, doubts were creeping in. The man who had seemed so transparent and open about his business was starting to feel mysterious in ways that weren't romantic or intriguing anymore. They were concerning. I decided to test something. During our next conversation about his business, I asked more specific questions than I usually did. What exactly do you import? I know you've mentioned luxury goods, but what specifically? Primarily fashion accessories and home decor items, high-end pieces from artisans in Europe and Asia that aren't available through traditional wholesale channels. His answer was smooth and confident. That's interesting. What kind of retailers do you work with? Boutique stores mostly, some online platforms. Retailers who want unique inventory that their competitors can't offer. Still confident, but more general than his usual detailed explanations. Which online platforms? I love discovering new shopping sites.
This time, there was a pause. Primarily business-to-business platforms, not really consumer-facing sites that you'd use for personal shopping. The evasion was subtle but noticeable. Alexander had always been eager to share business details before, even teaching me about import regulations and shipping logistics. This newfound vagueness felt like a shift. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to everything: his stories, his schedule, his behavior when he thought I wasn't watching. The picture that emerged was troubling. Alexander's phone was constantly buzzing with messages, but he'd start keeping it face down or in his pocket during our time together. He developed a habit of taking calls in another room, speaking in low voices that made it impossible to overhear even the language he was using. His travel schedule had become erratic and unpredictable, with last-minute trips that he'd mention casually, as almost if he hoped I wouldn't pay close attention. Most disturbing was how he'd begun managing our conversations. Previously, Alexander had encouraged me to ask him questions about his business, his travels, his plans for the future. Now, he seemed to be steering conversations away from anything too specific, redirecting to topics about me, our relationship, or general observations about life and business. The man who had once made me feel like his partner and confidant was starting to feel like someone who was carefully controlling what I was allowed to know about his life. But I was still in love, still invested in our relationship and the future we'd planned together. The inconsistencies were troubling, but they weren't necessarily evidence of anything sinister. Alexander could be going through a stressful period with his business expansion. He could be dealing with competitive pressures that made him more guarded about details. He could simply be tired and less attentive to things like weather reports and story details. I wanted to believe there were innocent explanations, but I was beginning to prepare myself for the possibility that the man that I had fallen in love with might not be exactly who he claimed to be. The foundation of trust we'd built was developing cracks, and I wasn't sure whether they could be repaired or whether they would eventually bring everything crashing down. What I didn't know was that those cracks were about to become a complete collapse, and the truth I was about to discover would make all my small suspicions seem pathetically naive. The discovery that changed everything happened completely by accident in the most mundane way possible, through Instagram.
I was scrolling through my feed during lunch break at work, mindlessly double-tapping photos of friends' brunches and vacation selfies when I saw it. A post from @MissLatvia_official, celebrating their recent winner's appearance at an international beauty summit in Dubai. The photo showed a stunning blonde woman in an elegant navy dress posing with several other pageant winners from different countries. But it wasn't the main subject of the photo that made me freeze. It was the man in the background, partially visible behind the group of women. Alexander. My Alexander, wearing the same gray suit I'd seen him pack for his Miami business trip the week before, standing close enough to the group to be part of their gathering, with his hand resting casually on the shoulder of a woman I didn't recognize. I screenshotted the image immediately, then went back to look at it more carefully. There was no mistake. That was definitely Alexander, at an event he'd never mentioned, in Dubai when he told me he was in Miami, with pageant contestants he'd claimed to know only through distant business connections. My hands were shaking as I clicked on the Miss Latvia account and started scrolling through their recent posts. There, another photo from the same event, this one clearly showing Alexander in conversation with Miss Latvia herself, both of them laughing like old friends. I searched for hashtags from the Dubai Beauty Summit and found dozens of photos from the event. Alexander appeared in several of them, always in the background, but clearly a regular participant, not a casual observer. In one photo, he was holding what looked like a presenter's badge,
In another, he was seated at what appeared to be a VIP table during the formal dinner. This wasn't a man who happened to know about pageants through business connections. This was someone who was actively involved in the international pageant community in ways he'd never mentioned to me. I spent the rest of my lunch break frantically searching social media for any other traces of Alexander's pageant connections. What I found made my stomach drop. Photos from Miss Universe events going back 3 years with Alexander visible in group shots and backstage photos. Instagram stories from various pageant contestants mentioning a business mentor named Alex who was helping them with international opportunities. A LinkedIn profile for A Crown Consulting that specialized in career development for international beauty ambassadors. The man I'd been dating for 8 months, who I thought I knew intimately, had an entire professional life that he'd completely hidden from me. He wasn't just casually connected to the pageant world through business connections, he was deeply embedded in it, working with contestants from multiple countries on projects he'd never mentioned to me. But the really devastating discovery came when I started looking more carefully at the other women in these photos. Miss Philippines tagged in a post from Los Angeles just 2 weeks ago, the same weekend Alexander had told me he was there for business meetings. Miss Morocco photographed at a restaurant in Miami that I recognized because Alexander had sent me a selfie from the same location during his last trip, claiming he was dining alone after a difficult day of negotiations. These weren't random encounters or brief professional meetings. These women were being photographed with Alexander in intimate, casual settings that looked suspiciously like dates. I felt sick, but I forced myself to keep investigating. I created a fake Instagram account and started following some of these international pageant contestants, hoping to see more of their stories and posts. What I discovered over the next few days destroyed any remaining hope that there was an innocent explanation for what I'd seen. Miss Estonia had posted Instagram stories from New York the same weekend Alexander had told me he was there for import business. In one of the stories, visible for just a few seconds, was Alexander's distinctive watch on someone's wrist as they held hands across a restaurant cable. Miss Morocco had posted about her business mentor helping her launch an international consulting career, using almost the exact same language Alexander had used when describing the opportunities he could help me pursue. Miss Bangladesh had shared photos from a work trip to Dallas 3 months ago during a week when Alexander had been mysteriously busy and unavailable for our usual dates. The pattern was becoming horrifyingly clear. Alexander wasn't just hiding his involvement in the pageant world from me, he was simultaneously pursuing multiple relationships with pageant contestants across different countries using the same strategies, making the same promises, and telling each of us that we were special and different. I felt like I was going to vomit. Everything I'd believed about our relationship, about Alexander's character, about our shared future was a lie. I wasn't his girlfriend and business partner. I was one of many targets in some elaborate international con game. But I needed to be sure. The evidence was overwhelming, but I had to know the full scope of what I was dealing with. I spent that evening creating detailed timelines matching Alexander's supposed travel schedule with the social media posts I'd found. The correlations were perfect and damning. Every business trip he'd taken corresponded to photos of him with different pageant contestants in those same cities. Los Angeles, Miss Philippines, multiple dates over several months. Miami, Miss Morocco, expensive restaurants and romantic settings. New York, Miss Estonia, hand-holding and intimate dinners. Phoenix, Miss Guatemala, business mentoring sessions. Even Dallas, Miss Bangladesh had visited while I thought Alexander and I were exclusive. The scope of his deception was staggering. He wasn't just cheating, He was running a sophisticated operation that involved multiple fake relationships, coordinated travel schedules, and carefully managed social media presence to avoid detection. But the worst realization was yet to come. As I continued investigating, I started noticing financial themes in these women's social media posts. Subtle mentions of investment opportunities and business partnerships. Photos from expensive trips and events that seemed beyond what a pageant contestant could typically afford. References to building something bigger and international expansion.
By Thursday evening, we had connected 7 women across 6 countries, all of whom had been simultaneously dating Alexander Crown while investing money in his fake business operations. The total amount we'd collectively given him was over $85,000. We set up a group video call that included everyone who was able to participate given the different time zones. Seeing all these beautiful, intelligent women on screen together, each of us having believed we were special and unique in Alexander's life, was both heartbreaking and empowering. "We need to confront him," Sophia said during our call. "All of us together so he can't manipulate the conversation or make us doubt what we know." "We also need to document everything," added Kadri, who had a background in law. "If we're going to report this to authorities, we need clear evidence of fraud." I volunteered to set up the confrontation since Alexander would be returning to Dallas the next day from what he'd told me was a quick supplier meeting in Houston. Of course, I now knew he'd actually been in Guatemala with Isabella, helping her plan her international consulting launch while taking more of her money. I texted Alexander that evening. "Welcome back. Can you come to my apartment around 7 p.m. tomorrow? I have something important to discuss about our business partnership." "Of course, beautiful. I missed you. Can't wait to hear your ideas." The casual endearment that had once made me feel loved now made me feel sick. He was probably sending similar messages to multiple women, using the same practiced affection to maintain his web of lies. The next evening, I set up my laptop for a video call with the other women, but kept the screen turned away from where Alexander would be sitting. They would be able to hear everything and provide support, but Alexander wouldn't immediately know they were there. When Alexander arrived at 7:15 p.m., he looked exactly like the confident, successful businessman I'd fallen in love with. Expensive suit, perfect smile, flowers in his hand, pink roses, my favorite, that he'd somehow remembered despite juggling 6 other relationships. "You look beautiful," he said, kissing me softly and handing me the flowers. "I've been thinking about you all week." For a moment, I almost wavered. This man had made me feel more special and valued than anyone ever had. The Alexanders sitting in my living room seemed genuinely happy to see me, genuinely affectionate. Could I have been wrong about everything I'd discovered? But then I thought about Lara, staying up until 3 a.m., crying about the money she'd borrowed from her grandmother, about Sophia working double shifts to pay the credit card bills from her investments, about Rashida, who had moved to a new country based on Alexander's promises and was now struggling to survive financially. "Alexander," I began carefully, "I need to ask you about something. I saw photos from the Dubai Beauty Summit. You were there with Miss Latvia and several other contestants." His expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Calculation maybe, or assessment of how much I might know. "Oh, that. Yes, I attended some events there. Good networking opportunities for the business." His tone was casual, dismissive. "I didn't mention it because the deals didn't pan out. I try not to bore you with business disappointments." "But you told me you were in Miami that week." "I was in Miami first, then Dubai. Quick trip. The supplier meeting in Miami led to an introduction for the Dubai opportunity." He reached over and took my hand.
Valentina, why are you asking about this? You seem upset. The concern in his voice sounded genuine. His explanation was plausible. For a moment, I understood how he'd been able to maintain this deception for so long. He was incredibly skilled at creating reasonable doubt and redirecting conversation. I'm asking because I've been in contact with Miss Latvia and Miss Philippines and Miss Morocco. They've all been investing money in your business operations, Alexander, just like I have. This time, I saw the mask slip. Just for a second, his confident expression cracked, and I saw something cold and calculating underneath. But he recovered quickly. Valentina, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Yes, I work with several former pageant contestants on business consulting. That's not the same as what we have together. You're my girlfriend and my business partner. They're just clients. Clients who you're romantically involved with? What? No, absolutely not. Where would you get that idea? His denial was emphatic, but I could see him thinking, trying to figure out how much I actually knew. I turned my laptop screen toward him. The faces of 6 other women appeared, all looking directly at him with expressions ranging from anger to heartbreak. Hello, Alex. Or should we call you Alexander? It seems like you use different names with different people, Lara said from her apartment in Riga. The change in Alexander's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The loving boyfriend and concerned business partner disappeared entirely, replaced by someone cold and defensive. This is ridiculous, he said, standing up quickly. You're all clearly conspiring to create some kind of drama. I don't know what you think you're accomplishing, but this is harassment. We're accomplishing truth, Sophia said from Manila. Each of us thought we were your only girlfriend. Each of us invested money in your fake business operations. Each of us believed your lies about customs delays and shipping problems and retail partnerships. The business is legitimate, Alexander snapped. Just because you don't understand international trade doesn't mean it's fake. Then show us, Kadri challenged from Talon. Show us one real contract, one genuine shipping manifest, one actual payment from the retailers you claim to work with. His jaw tightened. I don't have to prove anything to a group of hysterical women who are clearly jealous of each other. This is insane. What's insane, I said, standing to face him directly, is that you thought you could maintain this lie indefinitely. What's insane is that you targeted successful, educated women and used our dreams against us. What's insane is that you stole over $85,000 from women who trusted you.
I never stole anything. Every dollar was a legitimate business investment that will pay returns when the market conditions are appropriate. When? Amina demanded from Casablanca. You've been saying soon for months. When exactly will these returns materialize? Alexander looked around the room, at me, at the laptop screen full of faces that represented the collapse of his carefully constructed deception. For a moment, I thought he might try to maintain the lies, to somehow salvage the situation with more manipulation. Instead, he did something that revealed his true character more clearly than anything else could have. He laughed. Not nervously or defensively, but with genuine amusement, like he was impressed by our investigation and not at all ashamed of being caught. You know what? He said, his entire demeanor shifting to something I'd never seen before. You're all more clever than I gave you credit for. Especially you, Valentina. I didn't think you had it in you to figure this out. The condescension in his voice was shocking. This wasn't the man who had told me I was brilliant and insightful. This was someone who had always seen me as fundamentally stupid and easily manipulated. So it's all fake? I asked, needing to hear him say it. The business exists, the website is real, but the operations? Let's say they're more flexible than I originally described.
And the money? Gone. Invested in maintaining the lifestyle necessary to attract women like you. Do you have any idea how expensive it is to look successful in 7 different cities simultaneously? The casual cruelty of his admission was breathtaking. He wasn't even pretending to feel guilty or apologetic. He was treating our devastation like a minor inconvenience. You destroyed our lives, Rashida said quietly from the screen. I improved your lives, Alexander corrected. For months, each of you felt special, valued, loved. You had hope and excitement about your futures. That's worth something, isn't it? He actually believed this. In his mind, the temporary happiness he provided justified the financial and emotional destruction he had caused. You're a monster, Sophia whispered. I'm a businessman, Alexander corrected. I identified a market need, successful women who wanted to feel special and intellectually valued, and I provided a service that met that need. The fact that the business model required significant upfront investment from my clients was simply how the economics worked out. He was talking about destroying our lives like it was a creative entrepreneurship venture. Alexander picked up his suit jacket and headed toward the door. Ladies, it's been educational. Valentina, thanks for the lovely evening. I hope you all learned something valuable about due diligence and emotional decision-making. As he reached the door, he turned back with one final piece of cruelty. Oh, and Valentina, those earrings I gave you last month, they were actually a gift for Amina, but she has terrible taste in jewelry. I thought you'd appreciate them more. Then he was gone, leaving 7 devastated women staring at each other through laptop screens, trying to process the complete destruction of everything we'd believed about love, trust, and our own judgment. The man we thought we knew had never existed at all. In the weeks that followed our confrontation, the 7 of us became closer than I'd ever been with any group of women. What Alexander intended as competition and isolation became sisterhood and support. Kadri, with her legal background, helped us file police reports in multiple jurisdictions, though she warned us that prosecuting international fraud cases would be extremely difficult. Alexander had been careful to structure everything as voluntary investments in a legitimate business, making criminal charges almost impossible to pursue. He's done this before, Kadri explained during one of our weekly group video calls. Everything was too polished, too professional. The documentation, the psychological manipulation, the legal protection. This wasn't his first time running this con. Sophia found evidence supporting Kadri's theory. Through her connections in the Filipino pageant community, she discovered that Alexander had targeted Miss Philippines contestants for at least 3 years, always using slight variations of the same story and approach. There's a girl from 2 years ago who went through exactly what we did, Sophia reported. She lost $15,000 and tried to warn others, but he'd already moved on to different countries and different circuits. We realized that Alexander's business trips weren't just about maintaining multiple relationships. They were about cycling through different pageant communities, working each territory until it became too risky, then moving on to fresh victims who hadn't heard warnings about him yet. The Dubai Beauty Summit, we learned, wasn't a business networking event for Alexander. It was a hunting ground where he could meet multiple potential targets simultaneously and assess which ones would be most vulnerable to his approach. He's probably already working on his next targets, Amina said bitterly. Right now, while we're dealing with the aftermath, he's charming some new group of women with the same lies he told us. That realization motivated us to take action beyond just filing police reports. If the legal system couldn't stop Alexander Crown, maybe we could prevent him from victimizing other women. We created a detailed warning document that included Alexander's real name, photos, the cities where he'd been active, and his typical approach strategies. We shared it through pageant alumni networks, international beauty community forums, and social media groups where former contestants connected. Laura discovered that Alexander had been using slight variations of his name and story in different countries: Alex Crown in Europe, Alexander Corona in Latin America, Al Crown in Asia. We documented all these aliases and the specific lies he told in each region. The response to our warnings was overwhelming and heartbreaking. We heard from dozens of women who had encountered Alexander or men using similar tactics. Some had lost money, others had escaped before the financial exploitation began, but all of them recognized the psychological manipulation techniques we described. "He told me I was different from other pageant girls too," wrote a former Belgium contestant. "He said I had business instincts that most beauty queens lacked. I almost gave him money for European expansion opportunities, but something felt wrong at the last minute." A Miss Columbia runner-up shared, "I dated Alex Corona for 4 months. He kept promising to help me launch an international consulting business, but he always needed small loans to bridge cash flow gaps first. I lost $8,000 before my sister convinced me it was a scam." The stories multiplied, revealing that Alexander's operation was far more extensive than even we had realized. He'd been systematically targeting pageant contestants across multiple continents for years, refining his techniques and expanding his territory. But our warning campaign also had an unexpected positive effect. Women who had been isolated and ashamed about being victimized started connecting with each other and realizing they weren't alone. Support networks formed organically as former victims shared resources and coping strategies. "You saved me from giving him everything I had," wrote a current Miss Universe contestant from Thailand. "I'd been planning to take out a loan to invest in his Asian expansion project. Your warning came just in time." 6 months after our confrontation, I received an email that made everything we'd endured feel worthwhile. "Dear Valentina and the other women who exposed Alexander Crown, I wanted to thank you for your bravery in sharing your story. Last month, a man matching his description and using similar tactics approached me at a pageant event in Sao Paulo. Because I'd read your warnings, I recognized his tactics immediately and was able to avoid becoming his victim. More importantly, I was able to warn 3 other contestants who were also being targeted. Your courage saved at least 4 women from going through what you experienced." As for Alexander himself, he seemed to have disappeared from the pageant circuit entirely after our exposure. The international beauty community is smaller than most people realize, and word travels fast when someone is identified as a predator. Lara hired a private investigator who tracked him to Miami, where he'd apparently shifted his focus to targeting women in different industries: real estate, fashion, tech startups. The tactics were the same, but he'd moved away from pageant contestants once our warnings made that community too risky for him. "He's like a virus," Kadri observed during one of our calls. "When one population becomes immune, he mutates and finds a new host community." The knowledge that Alexander was probably victimizing other women was frustrating, but we'd done what we could in the pageant world. Our warnings had created a network of awareness that would protect future contestants, even if we couldn't save everyone everywhere. For me personally, the healing process was complicated and ongoing. The financial damage was devastating. I'd lost my entire savings and accumulated significant credit card debt. I had to move to a smaller apartment, take on freelance work to supplement my salary, and ask my parents for help with basic expenses. But the emotional recovery was even more challenging than the financial recovery. Alexander had made me question my own judgment, my ability to read people, my worth as a partner and professional. The confidence I'd built through pageant success felt completely shattered. I feel so stupid, I confessed to our group during a particularly difficult session. How could I not see through his lies? How could I be so naive? Because he was a professional, Sophia reminded me. This wasn't some amateur con artist making obvious mistakes. He'd perfected his techniques over years of practice. The fact that we fell for it doesn't make us stupid, it makes us human. Amina had started seeing a therapist who specialized in manipulation and fraud recovery, and she shared insights that helped all of us understand what we'd experienced. The therapist says that people like Alexander specifically target intelligent, successful women because we're more likely to rationalize inconsistencies and give people the benefit of the doubt. Our education and achievements actually made us more vulnerable, not less.
Learning about the psychology of manipulation helped me stop blaming myself for being deceived. Alexander had used sophisticated techniques developed over years of practice against women who had no reason to expect such elaborate deception. Slowly, I began rebuilding my life and my confidence. I threw myself into my work, taking on bigger projects and pushing for the promotion I'd been avoiding because I thought Alexander's business opportunities would make my regular job irrelevant. I also became involved in advocacy work, speaking at pageant workshops about financial safety and red flags to watch for in business and romantic relationships. Sharing my story publicly was terrifying at first, but it became empowering as I saw how it helped other women recognize and avoid similar situations. The 7 of us remained close, checking in regularly and supporting each other through the ongoing challenges of recovery. We'd been brought together by trauma, but we'd become family through healing. 2 years after the confrontation, I received unexpected news. Kadri called me with barely contained excitement. "They got him," she said without preamble. Alexander Crown was arrested in Miami on federal fraud charges, multiple victims, multiple states, over $300,000 in damages. It turned out that Alexander's shift to targeting women in other industries had been his downfall. A tech entrepreneur he'd tried to con had connections to federal law enforcement and resources to pursue charges that pageant contestants couldn't access. "Will they prosecute for what he did to us too?" I asked. "Probably not separately, but our documentation is being used as evidence of his pattern of behavior. The prosecutor says it's crucial for establishing that this was systematic fraud, not just a few bad business deals." Alexander was eventually sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to his victims. The money we lost was included in the restitution calculation, though we were told not to expect significant recovery since most of the funds had been spent in maintaining his lifestyle. Still, the validation of having his crimes officially recognized by the legal system was incredibly meaningful. For years, we'd been told that what happened to us was technically civil matter, not criminal fraud. Having a federal judge rule that Alexander Crown was indeed a criminal who had systematically defrauded women felt like justice, even if the financial recovery was minimal. Today, 3 years after I first met Alexander at that charity gala, I'm in a completely different place in my life. I'm debt-free again, successful in my marketing career, and in a healthy relationship with someone who values transparency and treats me as an equal partner. I still speak regularly about manipulation tactics and financial safety, and I maintain close relationships with the other women who survived Alexander's con. We call ourselves the Crown Survivors, and we've become a support network for other fraud victims who reach out after hearing our story. The experience changed me in ways that go beyond just being more cautious about romance and business opportunities. I learned that recovery from betrayal requires rebuilding trust in yourself, not just in others. I learned that shame is a luxury victims can't afford if they want to heal and help others avoid similar harm. Most importantly,
I learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can become the foundation for the most meaningful work we'll ever do. Alexander Crown stole $30,000 from me and 8 months of my life. But the sisterhood I found with his other victims, the advocacy work that grew from our shared experience, and the strength I discovered through recovery are worth more than anything he took. He's still out there, even though he's currently in prison. Men like Alexander don't stop. They just get more sophisticated or find new hunting grounds. But now, there are networks of women who recognize the tactics, share warnings, and support each other through recovery. The crown he tried to add to his collection became the crown I wear as a survivor, advocate, and sister to other women who refuse to let predators define their worth or limit their futures. If you're watching this and recognizing patterns from your own relationship, please know that you're not alone and you're not crazy. Trust your instincts, document everything, and reach out for support. The shame and isolation that men like Alexander count on to keep their victims silent are exactly what we need to overcome to protect ourselves and each other. The beauty queen hunter may have thought he was collecting trophies, but what he actually created was an army of women who will never let anyone crown themselves at our expense again. And to Alexander Crown, if you're watching this from whatever new life you've built after prison, we're still here. We're still watching, and we're still warning every woman we can reach about men like you. The hunt is over. We won. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult story. I know it's not easy to hear about manipulation and betrayal, especially when it involves tactics that could work on any of us. If this story resonated with you, if you recognize warning signs from your own relationship, or if you're currently in a situation that doesn't feel right, please reach out for support. There are resources available, and there are people who understand what you're going through. Remember, predators count on us staying isolated and ashamed. The moment we start talking to each other, sharing our experiences, and building networks of support, we become much harder to victimize. Trust your instincts. Document everything. And never let anyone convince you that you're too paranoid or too suspicious for asking questions and expecting answers. Stay safe, stay connected, and remember that your worth is not determined by someone else's ability to recognize it. This is Valentina Chen, and I'll see you next time with another story that needs to be told.
And so, this story comes to an end, but the pain it carries is real and lasting. Behind his mask, there may be charm, but also lies, manipulation, and silence. If you've experienced something similar, please don't hesitate to share it in the comments below or send it to us directly. Your story matters, your truth matters, and your voice might be the one that saves someone else from falling into the same trap. Together, we break the silence. Together, we unmask the lies. And together, we rise stronger. Thank you for listening. Share this story. Save a sister. End the fetishization.